You know, I never thought I'd be sitting in the ventilation shaft of a pirate ship, smearing a guard's blood on the wall, and planning how to commit genocide against a whole gang of space bandits, armed with only a pair of knives from my boots and the knowledge that their ship runs on unstable energy crystals. But here I am, Miles Brent, a former janitor from Detroit, who 3 years ago couldn't even imagine that space existed, and now I'm planning to blow up a starship from the inside. And the shittiest part of this whole story is, I don't even know if my crewmates are alive. To understand how I ended up in this nightmare, you have to go back to the very beginning, to the moment when our planet found itself trapped in what scientists call a negative spatial wedge, an anomalous zone of space where the laws of physics don't work the way they should. Imagine living in a house where gravity only works on Thursdays and electricity flows backward. That's pretty much what our situation was like. Earth's ozone layer, which used to protect us from ultraviolet radiation, had now become our prison bars. It amplified the anomaly's effect, making it impossible to use any advanced technology. Satellites fell like autumn leaves, the internet became a museum piece, and cell phones were only good for playing rock, paper, scissors. The world had rolled back about 50 years, and people were learning to live without all those smart gadgets again. Back then, I was working as a janitor in one of the last functioning office buildings in downtown Detroit. The pay was lousy, but the job was steady. People always needed someone to clean up after them, even in a post-apocalyptic world. Every day I mopped floors, took out the trash, and thought about how life had passed me by. 32 years old, divorced, no kids, a rented apartment, a classic loser story. And then 3 years ago, everything changed. First came the signals, strange radio transmissions on frequencies no one used. Then governments started holding emergency meetings. And then they announced the thing that turned every single person's life on the planet upside down. An alien civilization had made contact with us. Only it wasn't little green men in flying saucers, like in the old movies. It was an entire union of different races, something like a cosmic UN. They called themselves the Galactic Coalition and communicated with us through a primitive artificial intelligence that was simple enough to work in our anomaly. The first negotiations were like trying to explain math to an ant. The aliens couldn't understand why we were stuck in this anomalous zone and couldn't get out. To them, it was like discovering a civilization that lived at the bottom of the ocean and complained that they couldn't breathe air. But they turned out to be surprisingly patient. After several months of negotiations, an experimental program was developed. The idea was to build a ship capable of breaking through the anomalous zone and reaching normal space, where advanced technologies could be activated. Construction began in orbit. Using good old-fashioned railguns, one of the few high-tech things that still worked in our anomaly, we launched materials and components into space piece by piece. It was like assembling a Lego set, only each piece weighed a ton and could explode if mishandled. The ship was named the Dauntless. The name turned out to be prophetic because you had to be a truly fearless idiot to agree to fly on that thing into the unknown, or just desperate enough not to care about the consequences. The crew was chosen by lottery, not because it was fair, but because no one could determine what specific skills would be needed in space. So they decided to take representatives from all professions and social groups: doctors, engineers, teachers, cooks, soldiers, artists, and even janitors. When my number was drawn in the lottery, I first thought it was a mistake. But then I realized it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, an opportunity to become part of history, to see what no human had ever seen before. And frankly, my life on Earth was so boring that even death in space seemed like a more interesting alternative. The training took a year and a half. They taught us a bit of everything, from the basics of space navigation to survival techniques in zero gravity. Since no one knew exactly what we would encounter in space, everyone was trained as a universal soldier. I studied mechanics, medicine, diplomacy, combat tactics, and even the basics of xenobiology. But my main specialization became sharpshooting. It turned out I had a hawk's eye and nerves of steel. Who would have thought that a guy who'd spent his whole life mopping floors would turn out to be a natural-born shooter? The military instructors said I had a natural talent for it. The ability to slow my breathing, control my heartbeat, and hit a target from 1.5 kilometers away. The launch went surprisingly smoothly. The ship detached from the orbital station and headed for the edge of the anomalous zone. For the first few hours, we flew on primitive engines, using 20th century level technology. The atmosphere on board was tense. No one knew what would happen when we crossed the border. And then, the moment of truth. The ship shuddered, The instruments started going crazy, and for a few seconds it felt like we were falling apart. But then everything went quiet, and the instruments showed that we were in normal space. Immediately, the advanced systems began to activate. The ship was literally transforming before our eyes. Primitive control panels were replaced by holographic interfaces. Hard bunks turned into comfortable cabins with climate control, and the mess hall started to look like a five-star hotel restaurant. We felt like Cinderella after a touch of the fairy godmother's wand. But the most amazing part began when we almost crashed into a Galactic Coalition observation post. Imagine this. You're driving down a country road in an old pickup truck, and then you suddenly find yourself on a futuristic highway where glowing vehicles the size of skyscrapers are flying around. The observation post was the size of a small city and looked like a work of art. Graceful towers connected by bridges of pure energy, ships that moved without any visible engines, and beings of the most incredible shapes and sizes. First contact went better than we expected. The aliens turned out to be diplomats of the highest class. They greeted us with ceremonies, showed us their civilization's databases, and told us about the history of the galaxy. We felt like kids in a museum of wonders who were allowed to touch the exhibits. The next few weeks flew by like a dream. We studied alien technologies, communicated with representatives of various races, and planned future missions. It seemed that humanity had finally found its place in the universe. But then everything went to hell. The problem was that the Galactic Coalition was exactly what it called itself. A coalition. It was a diplomatic organization, not a military one. They didn't have their own army, just small patrol flotillas to maintain order in the civilized sectors of the galaxy. And space, as it turned out, was full of uncivilized sectors. When we started our return trip to Earth, we were given an escort, 3 small patrol ships. The crews were polite but clearly inexperienced in combat. Moreover, the Coalition's laws forbade them from teaching us how to use advanced weaponry. They were afraid we would become an aggressive race and start conquering the galaxy. The irony of the situation was that these very restrictions made us an easy target for those who didn't recognize any laws. The pirates appeared out of nowhere. One moment we were flying peacefully with our escort, admiring the beauty of space, and the next, scanners showed hundreds of ships approaching from different directions. Our escort tried to contact them through diplomatic channels. The result was predictable. The pirates just laughed and opened fire. The Coalition patrol ships were destroyed in a matter of minutes. Their weapons were designed for maintaining order among civilized races, not for fighting battle-hardened cutthroats. The Dauntless's captain tried to retreat, but we were surrounded. The pirate fleet consisted of ships of all different configurations, from small fighters to massive dreadnoughts cobbled together from the wreckage of other vessels. It was a veritable museum of space junk, but every single ship was armed to the teeth. The first wave of the attack consisted of boarding torpedoes. These things were designed specifically to capture ships intact. Instead of blowing us up, they breached the hull and released assault teams inside. The sound of a hull being breached is impossible to forget. It's not an explosion, but more like the sound of a giant can opener cutting through metal. Then the hiss of air escaping into space, people screaming, and the tramp of heavy boots in the corridors. I was in my cabin when it started. The first thing I did was run to the armory where my gear was stored. My sniper rifle, a pistol, and my father's family revolver, a relic from the Wild West that I carried as a good luck charm, plus a full set of ammo and protective gear. The ship's corridors turned into a battlefield. The pirates were professionals. They knew how to move on a ship, how to use cover, how to coordinate their attacks. But we had the advantage of knowing the terrain and the desperate resolve to protect our home. I took up a position in one of the central corridors, where I could cover several directions. A sniper rifle wasn't the most practical weapon in a ship's confines, but I adapted it for close quarters combat, using the scope for precise shots at short distances. I saw the first pirate 30 seconds after getting into position, a tall humanoid in heavy armor, with a weapon that looked like a cross between a shotgun and a flamethrower. He was moving cautiously, checking every corner, but he didn't expect a shot from that far away inside the ship. The bullet hit him right in the gap between the armor plates on his neck. He dropped without even knowing what happened. The next few minutes turned into a deadly game of hide and seek. The pirates realized there was a sniper in the corridor and started trying to flank me. But I kept changing positions, using the ventilation system and service passages, popping up where they least expected me. In an hour of fighting, I killed or seriously wounded about a dozen pirates. I worked in tandem with other fighters from the crew. Some held the close approaches with shotguns, others used grenade launchers to clear out large groups. We fought as a team, covering each other and coordinating our attacks. But the pirates weren't fools. They quickly figured out our tactics and adapted. The second wave of boarding torpedoes was aimed specifically at the sections of the ship where we had organized our defense. I felt a vibration in the wall a second before the torpedo breached the hull 3 meters from my position. The blast wave threw me across the corridor, and metal shrapnel peppered the wall where I had just been standing. My ears were ringing, sparks flashed in my eyes, but I was still alive and able to fight. I tried to get up to grab my rifle, but then a pirate with an energy weapon appeared from the hole in the wall. The thing looked like a hybrid of lightning and a laser. When he fired, the world around me exploded in pain and light. The last thing I remembered was the smell of burnt flesh and metal, and the realization that the burnt flesh was me. I woke up in a cell, not some makeshift prison, but a real one, specifically built to hold captives. Walls made of a composite material that was impossible to break or burn through, a force field instead of bars, and constant surveillance through hidden cameras. The pirates had taken all my weapons, the sniper rifle, the pistol, and even my father's revolver. They only left me my clothes with Kevlar inserts in my boots. They didn't know that hidden in the soles of my boots were 2 tactical knives, small, but razor sharp. For the first few hours, I just lay there recovering. The pirate's energy weapon had left second-degree burns on my body, but my armor had saved me from more serious damage. Every movement hurt, but my bones were intact and my organs were working fine. Then I started studying the cell and the guard routine. Every 4 hours, 2 guards in power armor would come, heavy exoskeletons that made them practically invulnerable to small arms fire. They would check the status of the force field, leave food and water, and conduct a medical scan. The food was edible, the water was clean. The pirates clearly didn't want their prisoners to die of starvation or disease. That meant we were valuable to them alive. Most likely, they planned to sell us on the slave markets or use us for a trade. On the second day, I started a psychological game with the guards. Every time they came, I would watch them. Not just glance, but watch. A long, intense stare, without breaking eye contact. I studied every movement, every gesture, memorizing the features of their armor and their behavior. I couldn't reach them physically through the force field, but I could affect them psychologically. A human gaze is a powerful weapon, especially when it's directed with the cold determination of a professional killer. And after all that carnage in the ship's corridors, I definitely looked like a professional killer. By the end of the third day, one of the guards started to get nervous. It was a woman, a pilot, judging by the patches on her armor. She began to avoid my gaze, fidgeting, checking her equipment several times. Her partner noticed it too and started getting angry with her for being careless. On the fourth day, she broke. When they came for the routine check, I was watching them as usual, without a word. The woman tried to focus on her duties, but her hands were shaking. Her partner started yelling at her, telling her to work faster. And then she snapped. She started screaming that she couldn't take it anymore, that this man looked at her like a demon, that he was planning to kill them. Her partner tried to calm her down, but she was already hysterical. He made a mistake. He tried to take her by the shoulder to lead her out of the cell. She flinched. Her hand hit the control panel of his exoskeleton, and it caused a short circuit. Power armor is reliable stuff, but it has one flaw. When there's a glitch in the electronic system, the exoskeleton loses control of all its functions for a second. The muscles of the artificial frame contract chaotically, the arms and legs start to jerk, and the safety systems shut down. And I took advantage of that exact second. The force field disappeared when the generator on the guard's armor failed. I shot out of the cell like a spring and jumped on his back while he was still trying to deal with his malfunctioning armor. Every exoskeleton has a service hatch for emergency access to the control systems. It's usually locked from the inside, but during a malfunction, the lock disengages. I knew this from the engineering course I took during my mission training. My fingers found the hidden latch. The hatch opened, and I squeezed myself inside the exoskeleton. There wasn't much room, but it was enough to get to the main control systems. The pirate inside the armor realized what was happening and tried to stop me. But in the cramped space of the exoskeleton, he had no room to turn or use a weapon. And I had the knives from my boots and the knowledge of the vulnerable spots of the human body. The fight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the pirate was dead, the female guard had run off, and I was in control of his exoskeleton. Admittedly, I controlled it poorly. These things were calibrated for a specific user, and the settings didn't match my physiology. My movements were slow and clumsy, as if I were trying to walk in a deep-sea diving suit underwater. But I didn't need to walk in it for long. I made it to the nearest engineering bay, climbed out of the exoskeleton, and delved into the ship's engineering section. The pirate ship was assembled from the parts of dozens of different vessels. There was no technical documentation, the schematics didn't match reality, and the corridors were as tangled as a labyrinth. But that also meant the ship was full of nooks and crannies where I could hide and plan my next moves. First thing I needed was a map of the ship. Second was a toilet, because 4 days in a cell without proper facilities had taken their toll. Third was a plan for revenge. I wasn't just going to escape. These bastards had captured my ship, killed my comrades, and stolen my weapons. It was especially painful to lose my father's revolver, the only thing that connected me to my family. No, escaping wasn't enough. I wanted to raise absolute hell. The engineering section of the ship turned out to be a labyrinth of pipes, cables, and various equipment. It was hot, noisy, and smelled of machine oil, but it was also where all the vital systems were located: generators, engines, life support. I found an engineering terminal and tried to access the ship's schematics. The system was protected, but not very well. The pirates relied more on brute force than on cybersecurity. Within half an hour, I had a basic map and understood the general layout of the vessel. The ship was a classic pirate dreadnought, huge, clumsy, but heavily armed. The central section contained the bridge, crew quarters, and living areas. The bow was packed with weapons, energy cannons, torpedo launchers, and boarding equipment. The stern section housed the engines, generators, and all the technical guts. The crew consisted of about 300 people, or, more accurately, 300 sentient beings of various races. Most were humanoids, but there were also more exotic life forms. All of them were professional soldiers, deserters from various fleets, or just cutthroats who had chosen piracy as a way to make a living. The ship's captain was a veteran of the intergalactic wars that had been taking place in this sector of the galaxy for the last 100 years. His gang specialized in capturing merchant vessels and kidnapping members of wealthy races to sell on the slave markets. After studying the ship's layout, I began planning my sabotage. My goal wasn't just to cause damage, but to create a cascade of failures that would lead to the destruction of the entire vessel. To do that, I needed to hit several key systems in the right sequence. The first target was the power generators. The pirate ship used unstable crystals as its energy source. Cheap, powerful, but extremely dangerous if mishandled. If you overloaded them, you'd get an explosion capable of tearing the ship to pieces. Getting to the generator section turned out to be easier than I expected. The engineering part of the ship was less guarded than the living quarters. The pirates assumed none of the prisoners could get there, and even if they did, they wouldn't know what to do with the equipment. They underestimated an Earthling with a technical education and a desire for revenge. The generator room was an enormous hall filled with humming machinery and pulsating energy crystals. The air here was so electrified that your hair stood on end, and metal objects sparked when you touched them. The control system was surprisingly primitive. The pirates clearly hadn't spent money on modern safety equipment. The main parameters were controlled by mechanical regulators, and the emergency systems could be disabled by simply flipping some switches. I spent 2 hours in the generator room, studying the system and setting my traps. I needed to make it so the overload wouldn't start immediately, but after some time, when I was far away from this place, it was also important to disguise the sabotage as an accidental malfunction. The mechanism was simple. I changed the regulator settings so that the crystals would start overheating gradually. The process would take several hours, and by the time the engineering crew noticed the problem, it would be too late to do anything about it. The next target was the life support system. If the generators didn't explode quickly enough, Plan B was to poison the air on the ship, not lethally, but enough to incapacitate the crew. The pirate ship's ventilation system was as cobbled together as everything else. Pipes of different sizes and shapes were connected to each other without any system. The filters hadn't been changed in years, and in some sections, they were simply missing. But this shoddy work played right into my hands. In one of the ventilation junctions, I found a supply of chemical reagents used for air purification. By mixing them in the right proportions, you could get a gas that causes nausea.